There is only one city in the world, at one time period in history, that could have ever created jazz music. Not only did New Orleans have the perfect mix of cultures to create this kind of music, after the Civil War, the city was absolutely full of discarded military marching band instruments and people trained to play them. Naturally, people picked up these European instruments, used their traditional European harmonic structures, and brought in influences from locally popular music forms which were created by the black community in the southern United States, like blues and ragtime. If you know where to look in jazz music, you can find fingerprints of folk traditions from Native Americans, from West Africa, from Europe, and from Latin America. Most famously, the rhythmic patterns of syncopation from West Africa and the traditional forms of Latin dance music were brought in to alter the rhythms of the massively popular American military march. Now, jazz music to this day is obviously still a hugely influential part of New Orleans' vernacular culture. It's still the standard marching music used by bands at weddings and funerals in the French Quarter every day. But it's with the Great Migration, the movement of largely black Southerners out of the South and into larger cities across the country, that really led jazz to fight for dominance at that #1 spot in American popular commercial music with marching band music. And in no environment was this more evident than in New York City during what was called the Harlem Renaissance. No artist represents this commercial and cultural high-water mark more than Duke Ellington, a figure who stood for both innovation and tradition as the genre hit several critical junctions, all of which makes his album Ellington at Newport one of the most concise summations of the jazz spirit as it is understood in American popular culture today. When Ellington first learned to play the piano, his favorite style to play was ragtime, which makes a lot of sense because ragtime was one of the genres that fed into the creation of jazz. He made a name for himself for the most part as an outstanding band leader and was able to attract top talent across New York City. Now, when compared to other kinds of jazz, big band is usually thought of as being closer to that military march tradition, in which each member is subsumed into the execution of one larger goal. But Ellington is known for breaking from this early on, allowing lots of creative freedom to each of his band members. Ellington stood at the vanguard of popular music whenever he allowed each one of his members to write their own parts, a technique which is popular across all genres today. That push and pull between Ellington and his musicians led to all sorts of situations where riffs became chord progressions, where chord progressions became solos, and vice versa. Now, a lot of what we hear from Ellington is reminiscent of the style that was ubiquitous among big bands of his era, the swing style, a style which is defined by catchy choruses and short, minimal solos and tight songwriting. However, Ellington was never bound by the traditions of swing music. By the time Ellington at Newport rolled around, his solo sections were quite long, numerous, and complex. On this particular performance, you can tell just how important each of the band members are and how much each of them were able to make the performance their own, because Ellington shouts each of them out at the end of pretty much every song. This album also excellently represents jazz music by using what we would consider today as jazz instrumentation, with a few minor caveats. By this point in history, jazz instrumentation had mostly solidified into saxophone, that's alto, tenor, and baritone, trumpet, trombone, electric or upright bass, drums, and piano. Ellington's band also included a clarinet, which isn't unheard of in jazz today, but it's a bit less common. And remarkably, the instruments which we now think of as jazz instruments are pretty much the same as those instruments that were being used in military marches over a century ago. And another iconic and representative aspect of this album is the way the crowd reacts to Ellington's band. The crowd ends up breaking into a riot because of how impressed they were with the several-minute-long saxophone solo. And the rowdiness of the crowd kept the show going for around an hour over its planned runtime. This is a good reminder that, although we don't think of it this way now, at the time we were just at the tail end of jazz music being the most dominant form of popular dance music around the world, just before rock and roll would go to take its place. And I think a big part of why this particular performance, and why jazz as a whole, succeeds so thoroughly, is its ability to both platform American individualism in its soloists, and that collective spiritual yearning that we find in the blues. For instance, Ellington's use of call and response involves the entire ensemble, and at times the entire audience, in one cohesive story. And of course, these solos don't just highlight our individualism, they highlight our whole cultural bias towards spontaneity, creativity, and virtuosity. And as I mentioned earlier, this performance is a glimpse into the sheer subversiveness that jazz used to carry with it. Jazz was a subversion of the marching band, just as rock and roll was a subversion of the blues, and punk was a subversion of rock and roll. And it really is this exact era at which this performance was recorded, at which jazz took a step back into the underground, replaced by R&B and rock and roll as the main forms of American popular music. And Ellington is reflecting that shift here, breaking out of those concise 3-minute songs into sprawling improvised compositions musicians. Now, jazz would of course maintain a foothold in popular music for a few decades onward, but from here on out it was more and more owned by the fans who were hungry for a deeper, more experimental side of their genre. And in this recording, Ellington really feels like he's leading us from that popular era into a more experimental phase. The creation of jazz acts as a singularity in the history of American music, the culmination of all previous traditions into a form so compelling that it literally put American culture on the map. Jazz did the unthinkable. It took an establishment art form, one literally created by the military, and gave it back to the people, even individual members within the band. Despite all of its contributions to all sorts of other parts of history, in the far future, historians will almost certainly pinpoint the creation of jazz music as the crowning achievement of the United States.